everybody for coming. I'd like to begin by introducing our two speakers. As I say, even though Doug is very famous, everybody will know him. So this session is very philosophical in flavour. It's entitled "Stabilizing Philosophical Categories as Interepistemic Translation." And the first speaker will be Douglas Robinson. Now, he's a professor of translation studies and head of the Division of Intercultural Communication at the Chinese University of Hong Kong's Shenzhen. I mean, he's incredibly prolific. I tend to say that Doug produces monographs faster than most of us produce shopping lists. He's up to 24 monographs, 5 dozen journal articles and book chapters, as well as the textbook for translators called Becoming a Translator, and of course his famous anthology, Western Translation Theory from Herodotus to Nietzsche. He actually says himself that almost every book he has written about translation is itself an interepistemic translation, which is a very interesting way of looking at it. So Doug will be talking about Wittgenstein, Austin, and Grice. Then our second speaker, Xiaorui Sun, is a doctoral student at the same university, and she has already published some articles on translation, including one in our last issue of Translation Matters, which was precisely on the subject of interepistemic translation. So I'd like to welcome both of you to this second session, second online lecture in our lecture series. And I would like to begin by asking Doug to take the floor then, please, if you would.
All right, thanks, Karen. Let me add that Xiaorui and I have a book coming out, co-authored book, half and half, called Translation, Pornography, Performativity, Experimenting with That Dangerous Supplement. Reading pornography metaphorically, and I'm going to be, in my talk, I'm going to be sort of building off of one moment in that book. Let me turn this around this way. So, hello everybody, good to see familiar faces. Our overall topic today is stabilizing philosophical categories as interepistemic translation. And in my case, let me see. That is Wittgenstein, Austin, and Grice. And basically what I'm doing is a bit, I guess, or else expanding our conception of what it means to correct somebody. In a way, what I'm doing is launching a corrective to 3 bad readings of these 3 philosophers, and arguing that that kind of corrective is actually a kind of interepistemic translation. That you've got different philosophical or otherwise theoretical models, and if you take this, read 2 different readings of the same text, one from one model, another from another model, and you translate between them, you show that the other one is wrong or this one is right or whatever. I'm arguing that is a form of interepistemic translation. So these are the guys that I'm talking about. My basic idea is that philosophical orientations are epistemic regimes. And I put Thomas Kuhn's notion of paradigms there, but in the humanities, it's very different from the physical sciences, where there's really only one single paradigm at a time of normal science. But in the humanities, we are always fighting over paradigms. There are many paradigms, and everybody claims their paradigm is the best. And what I'm suggesting as the 2 epistemic regimes or paradigms today are often called foundationalism and anti-foundationalism. In my reading of Wittgenstein, Austin, and Grice, They are all three anti-foundationalists. They believe there is no foundation for a study of conversation, of language. And looking at several readings of them from a foundationalist point of view. So attempts to impose a stable foundation, stable rules on these three thinkers. So let's see. These are the two people that launch the main misreadings, I argue. Mary Kate McGowan, who in fact spoke with us at the MLA this year, January of this year, on pornography as a speech act, and we cite her in the book. And then David Lewis at the bottom, who died a few years ago. He was professor of philosophy at UCLA and Princeton. And so Mary Kate McGowan, in explaining or explicating pornography as a speech, and so this is what I'm drawing on to get us started. This is a kind of map of the different interepistemic translations between conversational exercitives in Austin, cited by Mary Kate McGowan, and scorekeeping in language games, which combines Wittgenstein's language games with scorekeeping as imposed on Grice in David Lewis. And then also conversational implicatures and language games at the bottom. Yeah, so as I say, at the very bottom of that screen, different epistemic systems tend to have to be consistent, right? If you are Mary Kate McGowan or David Lewis and you want language games to be congruent with Austin and Grice on other aspects of speech act theory, then you have to impose the same basic epistemic system, in this case, the foundationalist one, on all three. So Mary Kate McGowan, this is really the starting point for the talk, is part of a whole history, whole tradition going back 30 years of reading pornography as a speech act. And she claims that it is like an exercitive, what Austin calls an exercitive speech act, but not the standard kind, which is backed by institutional power, rather conversational exercitives like ordering, urging, advising, and warning. And I would say it's actually not like this it's a bit of a reach, but when I was reading this scholarly history, her approach seemed the most interesting, the most defensible. But she cites David Lewis as claiming that conversation is a language game, and as a game, it involves scorekeeping, like baseball, and in conversing, people keep score by reference to Gricean maxims. She cites Grice's maxim of relation, which is relevance, which in translation studies has been championed by Ernst August Gut, drawing on Sperber and Wilson's reduction of Grice's maxims to relevance. And so I have the quote there at the bottom from her on the importance of relevance in a conversation, and treating pornography as have to build continuity relevantly. So for these two, for Lewis and McGowan, these are conversational rules, which would be a foundationalist approach. You want to keep time, pay attention to time? Yeah. So my first series of questions is how plausible is it that Wittgenstein, Austin, and Grice actually were foundationalists. Because in my reading, they are not. They're anti-foundationalists. But these two scholars, Mary Kate McGowan and David Lewis, read them as foundationalists. How plausible is that? Austin does seem to lay out tentative rules for speech acts. In the first half of his lecture series, 1955 lecture series, at Harvard in 1962, he has felicity conditions for the performative. And these are rules for speakers, but also rules for philosophers to follow when they distinguish between performatives and constatives. And ordinary speakers, he says, know the difference between a sentence structure like I warn you, which is a performative, and I irritate you, which is a constative. So I warn you is a warning, but I irritate you is not an irritation. And I give the example of here of a comedian saying I make you laugh, which is laughable. Obviously, you cannot make someone laugh by saying I make you laugh, but you can make someone feel warned by saying I warn you. So this is like the basic difference between a performative and constative that Austin attempts to set up in the first half of his. And he does divide speech acts into 5 different types and has category boundaries, which serve as rules. What about Grice? Grice has this notion that conversation is based on the assumption of cooperation, what he calls the cooperative principle, and the cooperative principle invokes 4 maxims. So the question is, David Lewis treats those maxims as rules, but the question is, does Grice treat the maxims as rules? And I would say no, but for Lewis, it's important to treat the maxims as rules because that way there's a connection. There's an interepistemic bridge between Gricean maxims and Wittgensteinian language games. So reading the maxim of those foundationalists. And the interesting thing about this is that what is radical about Grice is that he set himself the task of understanding communication, making oneself understood by other people without reference to rules. Analytic philosophy before Grice had assumed that without rules, without language being rule-governed, communication is impossible. And Grice said, no, I'm going to show how it's not necessary to have rules, to base the assumption of communication on rules. It's possible to break the rules and still be understood. For him, cooperation is not a rule, it's a principle. We assume it. And if we don't assume it, if we suspect it, then communication does break down. But again, it's not a rule, it's an assumption. So this is 2 ways of reading Grice as distinct epistemic systems. And what I'm arguing is that David Lewis and Mary Kate McGowan, in making generalizations about Grice as obeying the rules, are translating Grice's project of flouting the maxims as a way of communicating to a foundationalist approach as interepistemic translation. So what about Wittgenstein? Lewis discusses conversation as a language game involving scorekeeping, and he specifically mentions baseball. So rule governed, and by reference to the rules, we can keep score on what the other person is doing, what we're doing. Keeping score allows us to organize our speech are conversational encounters in a rule-governed way. But from a Wittgensteinian point of view, this is a bit absurd. I have some rhetorical questions here. Is baseball the only game in the world? Obviously not. But Lewis seems to take it as a paradigmatic game. So therefore, if baseball has rules and people keep score, then surely being rule governed and keeping score must be true of all games. And this is the whole point in Wittgenstein. No, it doesn't happen that way. This is the key quotation from Wittgenstein. Consider board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look, for example, at board games with their multifarious relationships. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out and others appear. When we pass next to ball games, such as baseball, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are they all amusing? Compare chess with noughts and crosses, what Brits call tic-tac-toe. Or is there always winning and losing or competition between players? Think of patience or solitaire. In ball games, there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches again, this feature has just appeared. Luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of games like Ring a Roses, Ring Around the Rosie. Here is the element of amusement, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? So when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it, are there rules? Maybe. But if they're not mandatory, the child may decide to make up rules, may decide to keep score, but there's no harm in not doing that. When children play Ring Around the Rosie, is there scorekeeping? No, of course not. Are there rules? Maybe, sort of. There's a way to do it, which everybody knows. You hold hands and dance around in a circle till you all say, we all fall down, and you fall down. But what if your mother says, you're all like 6 years old, and your mother says, you're in your best dresses because you're going to some fancy thing. And your mother says, all right, if you play Ring Around the Rosie, and when you say all fall down a little bit, right? That is a very different way of playing Ring Around the Rosie, but does it ruin the game? Certainly not. In fact, children's games in general are fluid. The rules may change constantly. For example, one child says, I'm tired of being the father. I want to be something else. And another child says, okay, you're the auntie. And the auntie has a cough. Says the new auntie. And then the other child says, okay, now the auntie died. Erg! The child playing the auntie keels over and dies. And then we say, let's have a funeral for auntie, and so on, right? Making up the rules as you go along. This is extremely typical of children's games. And really, there are lots of adult games that are equally fluid. They're typically games we don't think of as games, but for example, can be a kind of game. And there can be rules and scorekeeping in conversation, but very often you don't know what the rules are and you have no idea how to keep score. So Wittgenstein says that these similarities are like family resemblances. There's overlap and crisscross, but there's no paradigmatic language game. So what's happening here? What did David Lewis do in writing about Wittgenstein? Now, in that first bullet point, I say he forgot about this part, but obviously it's not true. He didn't forget. He just pretended that Wittgenstein did it this way. And he did that so that he could make a sense out of a Wittgenstein who's different from the one that I have read. And I would argue that in reading Wittgenstein and getting what he gets out of Wittgenstein, he is translating Wittgenstein interepistemically. And when I read Lewis as wrong, when I look to correct him and drag him back into a correct reading of Wittgenstein, what I see is correct, I am translating Wittgenstein interepistemically as well. So back and forth. This is Shoshana Fellman, her brilliant book, The Scandal of the Speaking Body from 1980, Le Scandale du Corps Parlant. Her reading of Austin is just astonishingly brilliant, and this is sort of who I follow in reading Austin. She claims that all at the end of the 7th lecture, he gives okay, good. So philosophers have attempted to correct for Austin's apparent mistake or apparent failure to make the distinction work, because analytical philosophy will govern the science system, and Austin is undermining that. So Emile Benveniste was the first to take issue, and this was before Austin's book was published. In 1958, Austin spoke in French. He wrote a paper called Performatif et Constatif in French and presented it at this conference in France, and Benveniste was the respondent. And he responded in a way that that basically totally rejected Austin's approach on the basis that Austin was insufficiently idealizing performatives and constitutives. He allowed real world mind this brilliant, really interesting and useful distinction. And he wrote that performatives cannot be reperformed. If you reperform a performative, it's no longer a performative, it is a constitutive. So, for example, the minister says, I now pronounce you man and wife, husband and wife, husband and husband, whatever. Reperforming that might be something like, the minister said, you are now husband and wife, or whatever, which is not really a serious complaint, but it does move Austin from this anti-foundationalist camp into the foundationalist one. Benveniste says that performative utterance cannot be produced except in special circumstances at one and only one time, at a definite place, date, and place. Performative utterance cannot be repeated. Each reproduction is a new act performed by someone who is qualified. Otherwise, the reproduction of the performative utterance by someone else necessarily transforms it into a constitutive utterance. So in a play or other fictional context, you cannot say, well, and this is a mistake that Austin made also in the book, and Jacques Derrida deconstructed him famously in 1972. Austin claimed that a minister in a play saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife, does not marry the actors. And Derrida said, well, no, that's true. He marries the characters, not the actors. But in fact, Benveniste claiming that repeating "I warn you" in a play or other fictional context wrong for Austen, precisely because he does give up the performative constitutive distinction. And I put this callback to "I irritate you" because there's an interesting spin on that, right? If I come up to you and say, "I irritate you, I 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 irritate you," and I say it 100 times or 200 times, eventually I will irritate you. So this constitutive utterance performs the action of irritating you. Language is so much more complex and so much more interesting and wonderful than analytic philosophers have wanted to believe. So Austen also says that no matter how carefully you perform an action or try to control of an action, you cannot control it. That any or almost any perlocutionary act is liable to be brought off in sufficiently special circumstances by the issuing with or without calculation of any utterance whatsoever, and in particular by a straightforward constitutive utterance if there is such an animal. In other words, performativity is completely without foundation, and that is the real world. And when analytic philosophers attempt to banish the discussion of performativity from the real world by idealizing it, that is effectively an interepistemic translation from anti-foundationalist to foundationalist epistemic regimes. And in addition to the attempts that these people are making to translate Austen, Wittgenstein, and Grice interepistemically from embodied failure to disembodied success, from reality to ideality, is not the only interepistemic translation that's been going on in this paper. My attempt to restore the three philosophers to their intended takes on language is another, from foundationalist back to anti-foundationalist. And I believe that is it for me. Thank you. And Xiaorui will take over from here.
Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you. Okay, and now I give the floor to Xiaorui for her talk entitled "Entanglement Between the East and the West." Thank you.
Okay, so actually this part, the entanglement between the East and West, it was submitted to Translation Matters, but because the article was too long, it's 13,000 words, so I cut this part from that article to meet the word limit. So when we thinking about the convergences between the East philosophy, or in my case, I would say Chinese philosophy, and the Western philosophy, people might think is a little bit incongruent, because supposedly the Western philosophy is scientific, it's individualist, it looks reductivist, but the Chinese philosophy is collectivist, is ecological and emergentist, so it sounds very different. But that is only the case if we look at it from the perspective of the normal, what I would call normal Western philosophy, which started from Plato, based on binary oppositions. There are oppositions between reason and unreason. There's mind and body. There's not. There are two totally different binaries. That is only the case then. But if you look at it from the abnormal Western philosophy, of course, that this is the genealogy that I made, or what I would call, in Doug's case, anti-foundationalist philosophies, which run from Anaximenes to Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Deleuze. In the current world, things are going to be different. First, Anaximenes. He is the third philosopher from the pre-Platonic school of Miletus. So unlike his predecessors, they all believe in material monism, but his predecessor Sales, he believes that the water is the origin of everything in the world, but Anaximenes believes that everything was derived from air, and that there will come in process, but only altering or transforming, we might call. And that is very similar to the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu in his contemporary age, because as you can see, Anaximenes was born in 585 BCE, and Lao Tzu was born in 571. So it's roughly the same age. It's quite amazing. I quote chapter 42 of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao, or the way, begets one, and one begets two, two begets three, three begets a myriad creatures. This is a translation from D.C. Lau. And then later on, his successor, Lao Tzu's successor, Zhuangzi, developed Taoism and extend Tao to mean qi. So Zhuangzi argues that life is a companion of death, and death is a becoming of life. Man's life is a coming together, and if qi comes together, there's life. It scatters, there's death. The 10,000 things are really one. So it is said you have only to comprehend the one qi that is the world. So as you can say that amazingly, those two philosophers, those three philosophers, or Anaximenes and the Taoist philosophers, they are thinking about the same thing. They're like the two poles of the world, but they were thinking about the same thing. And then the Western philosophy was kind of dominated by Platonic dualism until in the 17th century, when Spinoza picked Anaximenes' material monism up. He argued against Descartes' dissection of reason and emotion, or the mind-body binary. You must have heard about it. Instead, Spinoza believed in affect monism, positive or negative, as the changes in the individual's power that happen during body's interaction with other bodies. So affect to Spinoza is not just expression of human emotions. Not if you are sad or you're happy, it's not that simple. Instead, it's changes in your power, the power within your body when you are encountering with another body. The body, therefore, can be defined by its transformation and movement from one state to another, and the intensity and power involved therein. To him, affect is a becoming of such intensity, dynamic, fluid, and transformational. That is very different from the normal Western philosophy, which believe in dualism and the binary oppositions. So Spinoza's affect monism has influenced greatly over Deleuze, Felix Guattari, and Brian Massumi, and all this post-structure. And then we have Spinoza and Chinese thought. What's the connection between Spinoza and Chineseness? I found no direct evidence to suggest that Spinoza has learned something from Chinese thought, but Maverick suggests in his possible Chinese source of Spinoza's doctrine. He argues that Spinoza's tutor and friend Varron has quoted a lot in his book from a Christian translation or the Christian reading of Chinese classics, the analytics. And Maverick believes that maybe back then the 17-year-old Spinoza might have read Varron's book and then decided to leave the synagogue. So this is what I quote from Maverick, when in this book, which is the Varron's book, is told that the sect of scholars or the Confucians believe that God is the soul of the world, and that the world and all its creatures, several creatures are members. That is definitely not true in about Confucianism, because if anything, in the analects that the Confucius disciples have said that Confucius speak nothing of abnormalities, of gods, and of those brutal forces. So this is apparently a mistranslation of the Chinese classics in the eye of in terms of Christianity, but it is still an interepistemic translation because those Christians are trying to interpret Chinese classics into their own epistemic systems. It's just a mistranslation because it means the essence of the Confucianism. But I would like to argue that actually Spinoza still sees the essence or the what I call the mystical factors of Chinese classics that might can explain those Chineseness factors in his work. And then we have Nietzsche, who has also exerted great influence over Deleuze. From in his Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "Body am I through and through, and nothing besides." And the next paragraph is Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche. Deleuze says, what Nietzsche means by the power in the body is the intensities and forces enabled and energized by affect. Therefore, as we can see, this like a genealogy starting from Spinoza, and now Nietzsche is also caring about the affect and the power in the body. The body, full of passions and intensities, is always in flux, and this changeability always involves a process of struggling and becoming, which is exactly realized by the vital forces within. Those dominant and its inner energies, thus generating the emotional intensities and passions in turn. Apart from this, for Nietzsche, there's nothing left. So a lot of scholars have tried to discover if Nietzsche has been influenced by Chinese thought, but the result is quite negative. Actually, a lot of research has suggested that Nietzsche was actually more interested in Buddhism instead of any Chinese thought. But a lot of scholars has pointed out that Nietzsche's pre-Socratic philosophical paradigm and writing style, because he's not like those Socratic and Platonic this thinking pattern. They argue that his philosophical paradigm bear salient resemblance to the non-Socratic Chinese mind. So we might be able to say that actually Nietzsche translated interepistemically from Buddhism that may have been may influence Chinese thought a lot into his work. Then we have Gilles Deleuze. He developed Spinoza's affect theory greatly and give it a huge shape. He first of all distinguished between a tiny error that Spinoza made. Spinoza didn't distinguish between affect and affection. This is the definition that's given by Deleuze. So for Deleuze, affectus, or what he translated into affect, was determined as a continuous variation of the power of acting, while affectio or affection is a mixture of two bodies, one body which is said to act on another, and then the other receive the traces of the first. So affect is more like the changing, the increasing or decreasing of forces in the body, while affection is more like it happen when at least the two bodies interact with each other. So affect is passion, referring to the continuous variation of one's forces of existing and acting, the increase or decrease of power which have to be recognized and determined by one's ideas. The affect is a becoming, transforming, and constantly moving of the body, and its autonomy rather than the becalmed, transformed, and moved body, which is affection. Unlike Nietzsche, Deleuze was apparently influenced by Chinese thought, because in the co-authored monograph with Felix Guattari, they two of them directly integrate the word Tao in their own philosophical conceptions. When they are talking about the immanence and the deterritorialization, they say an intensive body without organs is Tao, a field of immanence, constituted plane to desire, which is part of the totality of all body without organs, a pure multiplicity of immanence, and all in movement of generalized deterritorialization. It might be quite hard to understand. Body without organs is a concept that he put forward in his monograph, Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation. But as we can see, he must have known Chinese thought a lot so that he can use the word Dao in his monograph to illustrate his ideas of the immanence, the plane of consistency. So he must have also noticed the power of becoming and evolving content in Dao or Daoism. So which, as mentioned above, upon reaching a certain state, is capable of begetting the myriad creatures. In other words, formed on the basis of qi, the Taoist body is dynamic, interactive, transformative, and deterritorialized, just like the. One example I would like to give that can really show the convergences between Deleuzian affect theory and qi theory in the Chinese thought or traditional Chinese medicine theory is hysteria as a mixed disease that has existed in the Western history for thousands of years. It has a very long genealogy. The different period of people give it different definitions, the cause of such mixed disease. So in ancient Greece, that doctors think hysteria was caused by the wandering womb in women. And in dark Middle Ages, people think that women got hysteria because the hysteria are actually marks of the devil. And in late Renaissance, people think that the reason must be female sexual overindulgence. And then later on in the 18th century, because people have a negative character traits. So all those different causes based mostly on the organs of the body. So which organ in your body has something wrong, is damaged or lesion, or is wandering, is floating, that's why you got hysteria. But in Deleuzian affect theory, or in his monograph, as I just mentioned, Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, he said a complete series of the body without organs, specifically from without organs to the indeterminate polyvalent organ to contemporary and transitory organs, precisely constitute the historical reality of the body. Which means that to Deleuze, hysteria is not a disease caused by organism, which specifically means the organs of the which specific organ in your body is more about because intensities or invisible forces beneath. He's not caring about the structure, the specific structure of your body, like your body can be divided specifically into certain structures, which is a more scientific perspective. He's more care about the forces, those invisible forces beneath your body. Not the structure, but rather the body without organs. Then how would Chinese qi theory look at hysteria? Actually, we don't have this. This is a translation or transliteration from the English word or the Japanese translation of the English word. But according to qi theory, because as mentioned above, we believe that qi is a basis of all things that can be transformed in anything in the world, material, air, spiritual, anything is qi as a basis of all things is empowered with destabilizing and restabilizing forces, and therefore carries the potentiality to be transformed into all kinds of materials and myriad creatures, and to channel the movement of all things. It is full of indeterminacies, complexities, which fits exactly with the Deleuze idea of about hysteria. Therefore, Asian Chinese people didn't look at a disease or human body from the perspective of specific structures or organs. They refer to a more dynamic, vibrant, and mobile way. They don't think if you have a disease because your organ has a lesion or damage. They believe that the disease occur only when the movement and transformation of qi as a whole is incongruent and inharmonious. In other words, if your qi, the different categories of the qi in your body is unbalanced, that's so as we can see, the Deleuzian reading of hysteria shares a lot of similarities with the reading of hysteria of Chinese traditional qi theory. We might be able to say that Deleuze is translating interepistemically back to the anti-foundationalist philosophical strand, taking inspirations from the Chinese qi theory. Therefore, different philosophical schools, including what Doug talked about just now, constitute different interepistemic regimes. There is no single paradigm in Kuhnian terms. Instead, there are always paradigm shifts and conflicts that involve interepistemic translation or even mistranslation. Thank you for paying attention.
Thank you very much indeed to both of you. I'm sorry to the people present that there were a few small interruptions when you were speaking. I'm not sure whether that was at your end or at our end, but I hope it didn't impede too much the intelligibility. And now I'm going to open it up for questions. I just actually need to visualize my screen in a different way. I can't remember how to do it. Visualize that, okay, so that I'll be able to see who's asking questions. Great. Okay, so it would be very nice if the people who don't have their cameras on could turn their cameras on, because I think, as I said last week, it's always a little bit unsettling for speakers when they're faced with a kind of wall of blank screens. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Now, if anyone has a question, I suggest you use your virtual hand. Is there anybody there? Immediately. Well, I could begin. I've actually got two related questions, which is sort of for both of you. So I was interested, Doug, in your in a sense in seeing this interpretation of your three anti-foundationalist philosophers in terms of foundationalisms as a form of interepistemic translation. And I was wondering if that is generalizable to any kind of interpretation. I mean, whenever an author does a reading of another author and extends it, expands it, would you call that interepistemic translation? I mean, for example, I'm actually just working on I'm writing a book on translationality in music, and I'm looking at your book on translationality alongside Piotr Blumczynski's Experiencing Translationality. Is he interepistemically translating you? Okay, and then I have another issue about you. Both of you mentioned mistranslation, interepistemic mistranslation, and in fact, Xiaorui, you actually highlighted that on one of your slides, and I was wondering if that's not an oxymoron, because. I mean, if you are, I mean, you Doug, also said something. You were sort of hedging it, weren't you? You said that in your you felt that these interpretations of Austin, Grice, and Wittgenstein were wrong in your interpretation, but then you said they are interepistemic translations, which all seems like you're endowing them with some kind of epistemic value, despite not agreeing with it personally. Then if you use the interepistemic mistranslation, then that seems to contradict that valuing of the paradigm.
Yeah, I would not say interepistemic mistranslation. I'd say misinterpretation. And
but if you use mis,
is my opinion of what I generously call an interepistemic translation. So that there's no contradiction. It's actually two ways of saying the same thing, that I disagree with them. And you know, this is a problem I have with interepistemic translation, that basically it's everything. Everything humans do is interepistemic translation, which makes it sort of too broad, too general, useful. It seems to be more useful to narrow it down. For example, by saying that two interpretations are really only interepistemic translation, two conflicting interpretations of the same text, only interepistemic translations if they come out of differing epistemic regimes. But it's easy enough to say, what about a whim? Like I usually read Nietzsche in one way, but today I don't feel like that. I just feel like reading Nietzsche in a different way. Is my whim on one day, is that an epistemic regime? Is it an epistemic system? No, but can we make a principled distinction between the two? Not really.
Well, surely an epistemic system has got to go beyond the individual. It can't be just the mood you're in that morning. It's surely you've got to be drawing on something which has got
Well,
internal coherence in some way.
Drawing boundaries.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. No, we've got a little bit of a time lapse. We've got a time lapse. It's probably because you're right on the other side of the world. Yes, no, I did hear what you said.
Yeah, I was going to say that these boundaries can be drawn, but you can also say the boundaries are an interepistemic translation, and there are different ways of translating those things. You can say that, if I am talking and suddenly realize that I made a mistake and change my mind and go off in a different direction, that I have translated my thought, but intralingually, speaking the same language, but I've shifted to a different meaning, to different episteme. Did you want to?
Yeah, no. Respond? Sorry, no.
Yeah, I do. We were talking about the boundaries, and I think it's true that if you feel very strongly towards certain epistemic system, you know that system very well. Like I'm a Chinese, so I learned Confucianism growing up. So I feel very confidently to claim that those Christian readings of Confucianism is wrong. That is boundaries, and I think the majority of the Chinese people will agree with me on that. But call it a mistranslation. But speaking of the value translations are mistranslation to me, at least. They still carry some value because those missionaries were trying very hard to bring classics from another epistemic system to let them be understood by their own people. That is very valuable. And actually, those missionaries actually were doing the same thing, like Matteo Ricci. He brought the Christian text into Chinese and suited totally into Chinese epistemic system. So people don't, back then, the Asian Chinese people didn't feel like they are reading a foreign text. They feel like they are reading a text written by a Chinese God. So that is valuable. I think we can call it, even though is a mistranslation to me as a Chinese.
And you could also say that the abnormal tradition of Western thought that Xiaorui tracked from Anaximenes to Deleuze reading Chinese philosophy and learning from Chinese philosophy. They're not reading Chinese, they're reading Christian missionary translations. And what they're getting out of those is not Jesus. It's not the Christian God. It's something else. It's a dissident kind of mystical thought that organizes a whole peripheral tradition of Western thought that is not what we normally call Western thought. And so if the missionaries are mistranslating, then the Western dissident thinkers are mistranslating the missionaries. And yet those mistranslations are incredibly productive. They generate all kinds of new possibilities and, in fact, a whole new epistemic system.
I mean, for that reason, I feel the whole idea of the mistranslation is rather counterproductive. Because surely if we're seeing these movements between epistemic systems as being constitutive of new knowledge, which is, I think, what we all agree on, I mean, in some way it's going to change. I mean, you know, translation, as you say, translation always involves change. So, I mean, I would like to relinquish the idea of the mistranslation. You're suggesting there's some kind of essence there that has to be preserved. I mean,
not necessarily in essence.
Sorry?
Not necessarily in essence, but a committedness in thinkers, right? We are not robots. We're not neutral. We are committed to different ways of seeing things. We are passionate about things that we believe, and the stories we tell about reality and about identity organize reality.
Of course.
The idea that there aren't mistranslations, they are interepistemic translations, is nice and fair and generous. But, you know, I really strongly believe that Mary Kate McGowan and David Lewis got those three guys wrong. They're wrong about them. And, you know, when the 19th century German Lutheran, British Lutheran missionary, G.G. Alexander, says of the Tao Te Ching that there's only one word in English that perfectly captures the Chinese word Dao, and that is God. That's a total misunderstanding. That's a total mistranslation. And you know, later in the book, he comes upon a place where Dao has to mean path. There's absolutely no way it can mean anything but path, which is the basic meaning of Tao. Here, the author has insisted on translating God as path, right? So, I mean, the internal evidence is overwhelming that it's a mistranslation.
Well,
but,
I mean,
you know, mistranslations can be productive.
I'm interested in exploring this more because you know, I think, you know, as the coordinator of this Epistran project, I'm very interested in establishing our boundaries and in actually understanding what our object of study is. And I think we do have some different opinions on this. I was actually hoping that maybe either Cobus or Africa, who I see present here, might have something to say on this subject. Because you've got your own ideas, I think, about what we're actually doing. Cobus, yes, please.
Yes, thanks, Karen. Hello, everybody. So I've tried to raise my hand, but the computer doesn't allow me to raise a hand on this side. For now, I generally think I agree with you about mistranslation, but for me, that's not the thing that interests me here. I think what interests me is, Doug, I think I buy the argument that every interpretation is a interepistemic translation, and what you've demonstrated makes sense to me. My question is more, if I step outside of that argument, that what you have been doing would be interepistemic translations, and ask about part of the logic of what you have been arguing, and that is, for instance, if Austin says that rules can be broken without that changing or without that completely disrupting the communication process, that doesn't mean that there are no rules. The fact that rules can be broken is not an argument for a complete destabilized communicative context. It actually confirms that there are rules. Well, maybe it's not good to call them rules. Maybe it's good to call them patterns or habits or whatever you want to call them. But so the argument that you are trying to make, that these authors, and I just sort of pick on Austin because I could follow up until there. Later on, it became a bit fuzzy for me. But the author like Austin seems, according to your own presentation, has both stabilizing and destabilizing tendencies in his argument. And that would allow your translation to be correct and the other translations to have some point of, let's say, correctness. Because there is communication isn't possible if there weren't some generalities against which to communicate. So I was just sort of trying to raise that as a argument that firstly, I'm not sure that one can destabilize everything. There needs to be some stabilities. And secondly, whether there isn't both the stability and the instability already in these authors, which made both translations to have some correctness in it.
Yeah, I think Grice is the one who says that people can communicate by flouting maxims or flouting rules. I totally agree that there are arguably rules or regularities in language, but I follow Bakhtin in saying that language communities are constantly attempting to stabilize patterns of usage into rules, and that is it's a constant project. Bakhtin says that language unification is not a given, but a project. Nidan azadan. It's a pun in Russian. It doesn't work in English. And that idea that unifying language around regularities or patterns is an ongoing project that all speakers are engaged in, because some sort of communication, I totally agree. I would just say that some form of regulation is not a foundation. There is no stable foundation of rules on which language rests. Rather, we are constantly attempting to create that foundation and always failing.
Okay, Cobus, yes. Do we have any more questions? They're all very shy today. Yes, please, Matt. Oh, sorry, Cobus, did you just want to respond to that?
No. I actually have another question, but I think I had my chance already. Matt can go first.
All right. Okay. Nice to meet you, Matt. We've just been corresponding. Okay. Nice to see you in the flesh, so to speak. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you too, Karen. And thank you, Doug and Xiaorui. That's a really interesting presentation today. I was thinking similarly to the comment that Cobus made, and thinking about Derrida's engagement with Searle, particularly in relation to Searle's reading of Austin, where, as I understand it, there's this kind of back and forth between them, and Derrida is really playing around with Searle's argument almost to the point of absurdity, and Searle's getting very stressed about it in his responses.
Yep.
And
Yep.
the analysis of that conversation has often been, one of two positions. One is to criticize Derrida for being a fool and not really taking Searle seriously, and just saying language can just mean anything. But the generous reading to Derrida, which is certainly the one I would take, is that what Derrida is very clear that there are structures and plays and patterns that govern critical commentary on language, but that doesn't mean speech act does work, it is demonstrable, but it doesn't mean you can take that up into a general theory of language, because the possibilities exist for something outside. And it seems to me that when we think about epistemic systems, we're thinking about this, and we're thinking about, is something a translation or is it not a translation? Is it a mistranslation? That we're actually working with, as I think you're saying, categories of stability, but the possibility that those are destabilized can actually function as a translation. And so I would say that there's a way of reading outside of the structure, which we understand often with the terms of deconstruction, that it itself is something translational. And we see something that seems to follow the rules or the patterns of something translational, but something that reads outside is also translational. I wanted to know whether you agreed with that and would see those both as equally examples of interepistemic work.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. At the end of Limited Ink ABC, Derrida says a very Bakhtinian thing, that every attempt we make to stabilize language also destabilizes it. And that tension between stabilization and destabilization is precisely what Bakhtin means by heteroglossia, or raznarechie in Russian. But also the whole idea of iterability, which is Derrida's deconstruction of Austin's ban on the reperformance of performatives, is a structure. And Derrida is working very hard not to turn it into a stable category. It's more of a kinesthetic movement or an economy or something like that. But he is imposing this notion that without reperformability, there is no communication. That's a kind of rule that he's laying down for the iterability of every utterance.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? If not, I would ask Cobus to ask his second question.
Thanks. So my second question is for Ms. Sun. Could you explain to me what you mean by the invisible forces beneath the body? And am I correct in understanding that statement is built into a particular cosmology that would not be limited to let's call it a Western scientific paradigm? So I'm just trying to understand, how you think about that, if you could, please.
Yeah, I think your understanding is perfectly right. It's not a scientific paradigm at all. What Deleuze believes in this, I don't. Later, Masumi defines, because Deleuze didn't explain what those forces mean. He just used the word forces. But later on, Masumi developed this and defined those forces into intensities. In other words, the decreases or increases of the power within your body. We can't really measure it right now, but you can feel when you have changes, you can feel there's an increase or a decrease, and that can't be described. It might be described, but it can be measured. That's why I call it, and Deleuze call it invisible forces. I don't know if that helps the understanding. It sounds quite mystical, I know.
Yes. So
And in chi theory, isn't chi also invisible?
Yes, it can be transformed into visible stuff, but it's basically invisible too. It's a refined matter, according to the definition in the traditional Chinese medicine, is a refined matter that is invisible in the universe.
okay. I think there's quite some interesting things to discuss here, but probably not necessarily now. Maybe I can just close with a question. So how would you relate this to biology, or is it fundamentally untranslatable in from your perspective?
Biology, did I hear it correctly?
Yes.
I think biology is very scientific. It's based on the scientific observation. Your cells, your genes, those are the real stuff. You can see it. Everyone can see it with certain equipment. So I don't think it can be defined in biological terms because it's invisible. We can't use the materials, the physical materials in the real world to measure it or to observe it. So nobody have a I would call a unilateral definition or observation on it. So it's very hard to define in biological terms.
I could contribute something to that discussion because I had a back problem for 4 months and nothing worked. I tried 7 different Western therapies and nothing worked. And finally somebody said, the 7th therapist said, have you tried acupuncture? And I hadn't, and I went to an acupuncturist and he was able to take away the pain. I'd been in excruciating pain for 4 months. When I left the acupuncturist, it was gone. And he was explaining to me the chi theory behind it. And the chi theory seemed like total bullshit to me. It's like, what kind of rubbish is this? There's something going through my body that if it gets clogged up at the nodes or something, and my back hurts. Come on. But I had sort of incontrovertible proof that it worked because acupuncture cured me when nothing else did. So in 2007 or 2008. Then in 2010, we moved to Hong Kong, and we had a school of Chinese medicine at the university, at Hong Kong Baptist University. And I got really interested in what they were doing and discovered that they were hiring Western chemists and biologists to test all the Chinese theories, all of them. And Xiaorui says, it can't be done. but they were doing it. And they were saying, yeah, this is why it works. They would, Chinese medicine, the potions they put together is like, bat's wings and stuff. To a Westerner, it seems like total idiocy. And so these Western scientists were breaking down the mixture of, I don't know if it's 100, maybe it's 20 or 50 or whatever, different substances, and discovering its biologically active, chemically active properties. They were studying acupuncture. What does acupuncture actually do? I've got a pain in my back, so they stab a needle in my foot. Right? It was like, give me a break. The pain is not in my foot, it's in my back. Right? But these Western scientists were going, well, okay, this is how it works. Right? So I think there is more of a chance of a realistic interepistemic dialogue between Western and Chinese science than we think.
Yes, I would actually agree with that. And I think actually it would be a marvelous project for somebody in interepistemic translation to actually try to establish that dialogue that you're talking about. I've already started thinking about it with relation to yoga, actually, because I practice yoga for I've been practicing for many years, and my present teachers are actually people who've actually got a background in Western science as well. So unlike other earlier teachers which I'd had who'd been very embedded in the Eastern system, they actually almost interepistemically translate in the lessons. So I mean, there's things like the idea of the chakras, for example, has got kind of correspondences in the Western notion of the endocrinal system. And I actually think it'd be marvelous to actually try to do some kind of a mapping of these different attitudes to medicine, and to actually see if it is possible to literally translate one into the other. And Marisa, did you want to talk? I know that you're a yogi as well, and I saw your hand hovering as if you wanted to speak.
No, thank you so much, Karen. I'm trying not to speak. I'm sorry. This is a terrible day, but I didn't want to miss it. I really, really liked listening to you two, but it's better if I don't. I have a background in philosophy. My BA is in philosophy. So I have my ideas on this for quite some time. And the way I see it, philosophy systems, and pretty much most of the discourses we here engage with are but descriptions of the world, and they're not compatible.
Not compatible.
No,
They're not incompatible.
There's a translation needed. There's dialogue that's possible if people are willing. And there are nodes that are difficult to overcome. But I think it's dialectically possible. I'd rather not. Thank you. But yes, everything you said. I was probably being too physical. I was probably just agreeing with you too physically. Sorry.
But is it not the same situation, exactly the same situation as translating between two language worlds? I mean, when a regular interlingual translator is trying to make sense of a language which is from a completely different part of the world and completely different culture, surely they encounter the same kinds of difficulties as kinds we're talking about here.
We do. I don't think we, as translators of languages, find as many problems or as serious problems as when we try to translate culturally within the same language with different social, cultural backgrounds. It's harder to communicate with someone who speaks your own language, but has different, I don't want to say beliefs, but a different vision of the world, a different reading of the world. Languages are the easy part. That's the easy part of the translation process. The problem is everything that's behind it.
Anyone else like to intervene on this subject or on one of the others that we've been raising? Or Doug and Xiaorui, would you like to come back? Oh, David.
Did you ask
David,
us whether we'd like to come back?
Sorry, Doug?
Did you ask us whether we'd like to come back?
Come back in. But don't worry if you don't. We've got somebody here. We've got another person who David.
Come back in. Okay.
David, you need to turn your mic on.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
It was just 2 or 3 observations listening. A very small one about the repetition of performative. In Sharia law, there is the idea that you can divorce somebody by saying, I divorce thee 3 times. So that is an explicit, repetitive, performative. There was a very interesting case of a number of years ago where two Egyptian actors who were married to each other divorced each other in a soap opera, and then the imams had to decide whether they really had divorced each other in
Nice.
which I thought was a very interesting, little angle on that. The other thing I was thinking, I've translated 2 or 3 articles over the years of somebody in our philosophy department here who's a Spinoza expert. So I was just thinking, when I translated those, as I think Marisa was just saying, I didn't have to interpret at a depth beyond what I was reasonably familiar with. Obviously, I didn't know all the ins and outs of Spinoza, but it wasn't an ideological system I was translating that was completely different to my previous knowledge of the world. And the final observation was whether there's always new meaning, isn't there? So, for example, we have groups like Bible study groups, poetry reading groups. Why do people go to Bible study? Why do they read the Bible, or another religious group reads their scripture? Because there's always this idea of the potential for ever more new meaning. So the idea that we get one meaning, it's done. So again, it's more a whole, and it seems to me that is a holistic perspective. You know, if you read part, you communicate with the whole rather than just, I don't know if I'm making sense here at all, or saying, or I'm just wasting people's time saying this, but there's a greater whole, and there's the recognition that we have not understood the whole. I just wanted to share that thought I had when listening to you. And there isn't really.
I agree with that. Do you want to talk about Spinoza? Thing that
Do you want to answer, Doug, or Xiaorui?
I was asking Xiaorui whether she wanted to answer that. I was going to say that when I have read Spinoza, my reaction has been that that's it? Whoa. Like, I read Deleuze, I read Masumi. For them, Spinoza is everything. I mean, not everything, but a lot. They get so much out of Spinoza. And so then I go to Spinoza and it's all just sort of ordinary. And so that is an interesting phenomenon. Because I have read about Spinoza from Deleuze and Masumi, I can sort of guess at the complexities they are finding in Spinoza. I'm just not philosophically equipped to get those same things out of Spinoza. And it may well be that it's not my equipment, it's just those things onto Spinoza. Who knows? I don't know how that works.
Okay, we have one final question, which is actually in the chat. It's from Helen Mary, who has got a poor connection. She asks, I want to ask about how the two speakers relate their work to Gaudama and Ricoeur's philosophical hermeneutic project.
I don't really know much about
Oh, wow. I don't like Gadamer, especially Gadamer on translation is really sort of unpleasantly conservative and missing the point. I mean, they're hermeneutes. They're doing hermeneutical research, and there's interesting stuff in them. With Ricoeur's book on translation, but I think I read one of his books 40 years ago, and I don't remember anything about it. So I'm not really in a good position to answer that question. I do think of myself as doing hermeneutical work as well, but I'm much more strongly connected to Schleiermacher and Dilthey, and the ways in which Dilthey's manumission of Schleiermacher into the 20th century inspires Husserl, who inspires Merleau-Ponty, and who inspires Varela, Thompson, and Roche, and so on. That whole tradition is much more exciting for me in hermeneutics and phenomenology than either Gadamer or Ricoeur.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's actually more or less 1 o'clock, and as I mentioned at the beginning, I've actually got a train to catch 2 o'clock. So I think we're going to have to call it a day today. So I'd really like to thank Doug and Xiaorui once again for your very interesting talks, and to everybody who's been present today and has contributed to the discussion afterwards. Okay, so we can have a round of virtual applause. Okay. Thank you so much. And I'd like to remind you that the next of our online talks, there won't be one next week, and this is because we've got a couple of PhD defences at the end of the week next week. But the next one will be on the 12th of December, and we will be inaugurating our new strand, a brand new strand on cyber translation. So we've got a talk by our own Marco called Cyber Translation Proposals for Studying Human-Machine Epistemic Translation. And then we've got a second talk from Raluca Tănăsescu from the University of Galway, who's going to be talking about literary translation in cyberspace, medium theory, and epistemic dimensions. So I very much hope that some of you at least will be able to be present for that. Okay. And please have a good weekend and a good week. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah.